Good afternoon, and welcome to this, what I hope will be an exciting discussion on a very fascinating book by our truly Bonnie Snyder right here, who has written the book Undoctrinate. Undoctrinate, I'm so sorry. Undoctrinate, it's been a long day, but Undoctrinate. So before we start, let me go first introduce our wonderful set of panelists. First, we have Gladden Pappin. Gladden Pappin is an assistant professor of politics at the University of Dallas and senior visiting fellow with MCC. He is also the co-founder and deputy editor of American Affairs, as well as a senior advisor and permanent research fellow at the University of Notre Dame. Next to him, we have Werner Patzelt, who is also a visiting fellow at MCC, and he previously served as the full professor of political systems and comparative analysis at the Technical University of Dresden, Germany. And next to him, we have János Sétányi. He is the head of the Learning Institute at MCC, and he has served as a researcher at the Institute for Educational Research, a reform workshop and intellectual center of educational democratization. And finally, we have, last but not least, Bonnie Snyder. She is the director of high school outreach at the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education and an American educator with 20 plus years of experience in a variety of roles in different institutions, including teacher, counselor, administrator, and professor in both public and private schools. Bonnie is an honors graduate of Harvard University with a master's degree in counseling from Virginia Tech and a doctorate in higher education from Penn State. She is the author of several books on education, including The New College Reality, Finding Your Voice, a free speech comic, and of course, Undoctrinate, How Politicized Classrooms Harm Kids and Ruin Our Schools, and What We Can Do About It. So with that, let's go ahead and begin. Now, when I was looking over your book, based on the title and subject, I think if it had to be summed up in one word, it would have to be indoctrination. So what exactly do you mean by that? What is your definition of indoctrination when you use that word to describe our current system in American schools?
Yeah, I think that I'm very literal. Is this on? Okay, I'm very literal when it comes to it. To me, indoctrination means inculcating a doctrine. Like orthodoxy. So that's the docked part of indoctrination. So I'll just leave it at that.
And let's go down the panel. Do you guys agree with her definition, or what is your own definition of indoctrination, especially when we're talking about a school system, what's occurring in there?
Well, pretty similar, with a slight exception that in the first 30 years of my life, I spent it in a system called communism, and I was indoctrinated. So I have very practical memories about a systemic indoctrination in education.
Well, how I use the term is quite similar. I would like to use the term in a big, broader context. I mean, indoctrination is imposing a mindset on other people, either overtly or in a concealed way. And if this mindset is imposed against open or at least to be felt resistance, then we might even talk about totalitarian indoctrination, because this is imposing something against explicit desires, wishes, intentions, whatever else of those people affected. So we are absolutely close to each other.
Well, and if I could amend mine or append it, I would say I would also define indoctrination as learning without freedom, or learning without liberty.
Probably one more little thing. The content of indoctrination is designed. It's not organic, not natural, not bottom-up. It's top-down, artificial, and designed. Intellectual to some extent.
Can I start with a question?
Sure.
So Bonnie, just trying to understand a little bit better what you mean by this. You know, how would you consider like patriotic, the traditional patriotic parts of American education? I mean, I take it that you would probably, and I think maybe your answer was getting a little bit toward this, but I guess I'm just putting myself first in the mindset of like someone who was against American patriotic education. Like, well, they make people take the Pledge of Allegiance every day. You know, they make them celebrate holiday, you know, July 4th, blah, blah, blah. You know, that's a form of indoctrination. Like, what would you say to that?
Yeah, I would agree that it's a form of indoctrination, and I'm for it.
Okay. Could you bring that together for me? Because I agree with you.
With the freedom to dissent. So, for example, in America, there is a very famous Supreme Court case, West Virginia versus Barnett. And I work for a free speech organization. So, the case deals with the salute to the flag, which is a unique American ritual if you really look at it in great depth. It's
strange. Yeah.
It's a little strange. It's a strange American ritual that I do. But it only really means something if you have the right not to do it. If everyone was forced to do it, then it really would be a very meaningless gesture. So many of our free speech cases in America come from challenges from religious groups. In this case, it was Jehovah's Witnesses who objected to it on religious grounds. They felt like it was showing homage to a symbol that was not religious, and that violated their convictions. And it's one of the most eloquent cases in American jurisprudence, and I think the ultimate, it's well worth reading if anyone is interested. I recommend that you look up West Virginia versus Barnett. And I believe the decision was that if there's any fixed star in our American Constitution, it's that no official, high or petty, shall prescribe what shall be orthodox in American life, generally speaking. It is known as the compelled speech doctrine. So you cannot be compelled. Like on the previous panel, you had mentioned that, it's obligatory to list your gender pronouns, for instance. And I was tempted to say, but I didn't, but that's compelled speech, and we would defend you, or that you have a right. And there are in Loudoun County, as a matter of fact, there is a teacher who is challenging the requirement. Well, it's the requirement to call students what they require to be called versus what he sees them as. So that's my answer.
I think it would be very important to draw a clear distinction between the old traditional civic education with some interesting rituals. Some might smile a little bit in Europe about that, but it's for a hybrid nation, full-fledged citizenship education organized around the Constitution of the United States. This is, for me, absolutely acceptable and necessary. UK is a hybrid nation now. They are building something, if not similar, but a kind of hybrid civic education around abstract values, but it's okay because of the melting pot. What is going on at the moment is a totally different thing. And one more thing, that usually indoctrination is built around utopian goals. And that's very important, which is what we experienced, the old people in Eastern Europe, that everybody knew that it's utopian and dysfunctional. And the results, I will tell about the results later. It's not so tragic. The spoiler is here that we will survive.
I would like to add a few comments to that, because it's really important to make a distinction between civic education and, well, providing the next generation with a good feeling for their own country, and indoctrination. See, I've been active in East German civic education for 20 years, and I was active there exactly in the years after the fall of the wall, when I moved from West Germany to East Germany, and I had to build up in the state of Saxony the school system of civic education. And of course, we were confronted with questions of kicked out teachers of Marxism, Leninism, with the question, hey, what is the difference between what you call indoctrination, what we should have done, and what you now call civic education? So, and there is an important distinction. The distinction is, on the one hand, that you not do simply impose something on people who reluctantly or not buy what you're selling to them, and it is done in a discursive way. You're discussing the things, you're explaining the things, you're open to challenges, and it is a communicative and deliberative process in which you teach these things. And it is important to convey the meaning of a certain political structure, like we, the United States, home of the brave, and so on. Fine, it is necessary to convey this to the next generation if you think this is the proper thing. And I really would warn against calling this an indoctrination. It is natural, it is necessary. Civic education is necessary. You have to teach teach people the rules by which they have to abide, along which they have to play the political game, the values which are behind or underneath these rules. But this I would really warn not to call indoctrination. This is something quite different.
Agreed. And also we teach by demonstrating it, and free speech is such an important part of American culture, and if we don't demonstrate that and practice it in the classroom, then we're undermining our civic education.
Yep.
Well, this panel is so good that they've already answered like 3 or 4 of my questions on my list.
Sorry for
so
that.
I really don't even know if I need to be here. I might want to step down and just let you guys talk. Because my second question was, is there a form of good or bad indoctrination? And I think for the most part, you guys answered that with, you wouldn't even call it indoctrination, but that it's not that schools should produce or should not convey no values. It's just there's a method of how to convey those values, and of course whether or not those values are morally good. But let me ask, what role also is played in this, for example, the support of the community? Because I also think, for example, a lot of what we're talking about indoctrination, whether it was with the Soviet Union or, for example, what we're seeing in the United States, most parents don't even support what they're teaching. Do you think it's less of an indoctrination or not indoctrination if what the school is conveying is supported by the parents? That essentially it is more okay that a schools, convey values, but it's important that these values are also supported by the parents.
Well, the Protestant tradition says that a small community should control the school, the content, and the values. That's a contradiction because in a modern democratic society we need a common ground. It should be discussed and reviewed every single day, of course, but we need a common things that bounds us together from the point of content and values too. So I would very much argue for this common ground, but we are living the age of polarization now. But obviously those things which fall apart will come together a bit later. We hope so. Let's see an example when they don't come together. That's the communist case when the public, and this is a small lesson for the Western colleagues, public discourse was controlled by the official mantra, this communist mantra, and every parents and student, kids, they learned it. So publicly, the people spoke in a way which conformed to the expectations. On the other hand, privately, there was a double reality. Everybody spoke normally. And let's see the islands of freedom, family, where political debates were forbidden and women controlled and suppressed the political debates of men, because family values, women are wiser and they knew that family is more important than political views. Pubs, rundown pubs, so drinking was okay, and there was a free atmosphere. Football stadiums, soccer in American stadiums were typically hunting societies for men, and these kind of islands. And drunkenness was tolerated. Drunken people could speak normally. This is why Russian drank so much. It was a way of survival for men, males. Women didn't drink so much. They were pragmatic. So there is no total takeover, and there are always islands of freedom, and the maximum damage you could experience in the future is the birth of a double speak and a double reality society. But then it can be returned later on.
I think the answer to your question depends very much on whether you're living in a homogeneous society where, so to speak, public culture and private culture are very much the same, and all of them based on voluntary agreement and not simply imposed from above. But as soon as you have a society with many cultural differences, like we have in Germany right now, with Turkish families living up to quite different value sets than the official ones of Germany, then things become a bit more difficult. Basically, I agree that what is taught in schools and what parents believe that should be taught should be very much in agreement, like you explained it before as to American standards. But we should not exclude the possibility that the life world in which children are brought up by their parents is something absolutely isolated from the shared culture which you want to preserve, of course, by the means of the educational system as well. And in this case, this, so to speak, pre-stabilized harmony between what parents want to be the case and what the educational system wants or thinks should be the case is not given. And then you need to be prepared for conflict. Sometimes the schooling system, the educational system, must bring to young students, to pupils at the schools, different values than those they know from at home. This conflict is inevitable as soon as private cultures or partial private cultures contradict the necessary common culture of a political system. And in order to avoid to be too harsh on this point, I would at least make the point opening up the minds of the young persons who come to the schooling system, opening up the eyes. There are different ways of thinking about the world. There are different preferences that you might like as soon as you know them without any prejudice. Opening up the minds. This is a very, very important task of the educational system, and this should be added to the whole issue of how close should be the matters you teach in school to those things you learn and receive from your parents.
Yeah, agreed. And I think you're talking, you know, in America, we're known as probably the most individualistic culture in the world, or at least traditionally we have been. And so is that tension between the individual versus the collective. And, you know, every child, I think, is born into a collective. They're born into a family that's basically, you know, the family operates according to the Marxist principle, from each according to their ability to each according to their needs, because a baby's helpless and contributes nothing and receives everything and then is expected somehow to give that up and become self-reliant. But it, also in this age of polarization, you know, maybe another word for that could be, or it's like the dialectic of, I'm not opposed to people hearing a variety of views in schools. I encourage it. What I'm opposed to is them not hearing a variety of ideas in the school. And they're using this idea of repressive tolerance, this Marcusean idea, to say that only some ideas may be presented, and because the opposing views cause harm is usually the language in which it's framed. And so that is what I would push it back against.
I think in education, I think probably pretty close to what you were saying, but education is always political. I mean, it's always oriented toward some understanding of the needs of a political community. And that's true of education, which emphasizes you know, acceptance and repetition of a particular doctrine. It's also true of education in a liberal society, which emphasizes openness and tolerance. Both of those are kind of part of the way of life of that community. So, you know, Aristotle wrote a book about politics in which he described, you know, the things that make polities last versus the things that tear them apart and undermine them. He called these regimes, which is maybe a harsher word in English or in modern speech than it was in his conception. But he said, you know, of all of the things that preserve regimes or polities and make them last, education is the greatest of those things. Not just education in the abstract, but education relative to the principles of the regime. Education in the habits that make you a citizen. Education in the history that informs your you know, self-understanding and your identity. You know, we don't have to put all of those things under the notion of indoctrination. We might call them something like inculcation, you know, inculcation of civic virtues, you know, inculcation of, you know, the habits that go into the expected behavior of being a member of a certain society. So you could live in a slightly more egalitarian society where one of the expectations communicated through education is that you don't wear really flashy jewelry or something like that and, you know, set yourself too much apart. Or if you live in a small oligarchical society, maybe the educational emphasis is in exactly the opposite direction. Both of those are, you know, valid ways of educating that perpetuate something of the way of life of their regime. So, you know, in the ideal circumstance, obviously parents themselves, having been educated as a part of the community, share in its life. That's also really been a part of American schools from the beginning, and sometimes controversially. The existence of Catholic schools was extremely controversial in the United States in the 19th century. Unfortunately, from my standpoint as a Catholic, and even with regard to our American Indian populations, many of them were basically subjected to a form of education which was intended to inculcate in them the virtues that were seen to be necessary in an industrial society. Inculcating them, training them how to work hard. In many cases, those led to abuses, but the fundamental problem can't completely be resolved one way or the other. Every society tries to educate people in the way of its expectations. I think sometimes when we talk about indoctrination, particularly in the American context, I think we're talking about particular groups of teachers who have a militant idea for replacing the regime. They want to replace it with something else. And they occupy these very influential positions over students, and they essentially inflict upon them an education which is totally at odds with what otherwise makes the society tick and makes the society survive.
Sort of anti-patriotic is what they're promoting and in some cases imposing, which is what I encountered with my own daughter. Just to give a couple of concrete examples, the first instance I saw of trouble, and this was at a private school, this was 10 years ago, was my daughter, it was Columbus Day, and my daughter came home and told me that her teacher had informed her that Christopher Columbus was a giant douchebag at school. So yeah, exactly. So I had to go in and have that conversation, and I said, first of all, language. And just teachers trying to use juvenile language to appeal to younger people, and what I encountered was a flat-out denial that it had even happened. So now we've got lying, and I was able to prove that the teacher was lying by torturing her, by giving her the positive, virtuous story of Columbus until she couldn't take it anymore, and she blurted out, but he was a homicidal, genocidal maniac, and I said, so now we've gotten to the point of this issue. But then I went home and I was like, well, my daughter's teacher's a liar. And I had to say to her, look, I expect you to instruct my daughter in virtues and values that I believe in, and lying isn't one of them. And you've demonstrated that. And so, but they also gave my daughter a lesson, which was a roundtable discussion, and they gave her the Communist Manifesto to read, which I don't object to. It's a very important book. I think everyone should know it. And then they asked the class to debate communism versus capitalism, and her class concluded that communism was a better system of government than capitalism. And my daughter came home and she said, Mom, I tried to defend capitalism, but they didn't give me anything to read about it, so I didn't know what to say. So I had to go in and say, do you consider this a quality learning exercise? Because I sure don't. And the really funny thing that I'd like to point out is one of the boys in that class actually who said communism is a better system, his father literally owns a factory. And so I just love that story. But then there's shaming involved with it too. She was called evil for supporting capitalism. And I was like, and so I had to go in at one point and be like, here are a list of names that my child is never to be called in this school again. And evil is one of them, and fascist was another, and so on and so forth. And I was like, these teachers were just not skillful. Shall we put it that way? Not skillful.
But it's not the worst yet, because the next way will be to keep self-criticism sessions.
We have those.
You already have. Yes. Yeah, because I think the model is the great proletarian revolution of the Chinese. They went already through that, and the stages are very clear, and you are advancing very nicely on this ladder, but it's a half joke.
Soviet joke.
Yes.
Well, it was the check your privilege movement was where this started a few years ago. As you matriculate at top American universities, there was a moment a few years ago. I don't know if it's still I think it's moved on to a new form, but you have to acknowledge the unfair advantages that were a part of your education, your privileges.
And we do have a lawsuit that has proceeded where a biracial student was told to confess his white privilege in school and refused, and the mother is suing, and looks
But the problem is that the next step is going to agricultural work, to the countryside, to re-education. But let's stop this round around it. I'm ironizing. But one more thing is that obviously there is the first front line of teaching about our values, and that's endangered. But the second line where we can come back for a better defense is not the line of the obvious clear values of the preaching and teaching, but just the working habits. I can mention two things or three. One is homework. Second is subject-based curriculum. Subjects are difficult and it's not fun. School is not fun in Central Europe. It's hard work. Physics, there is nothing to love about chemistry or physics. It's difficult. At least for me. But it has a higher meaning in the long term. And the third thing, let it be tradition and history. So there is no shortcut like projects, sociology, and things like that. But history, the depth, is very important. And I'm not quite sure about the situation in US that now we are in the second defense line now. Have we lost the battle already, or are these defense elements still performing?
There are more forces joining the field to defend, I think, the traditional view of history. So I am optimistic.
And I think that we need to disentangle different issues. What we have called the second line of defense has to do with the simple fact that neither teaching nor learning is only fun. It's hard work, and sometimes you try to get rid of hard work to try to find a way around it, and this sometimes is called an educational reform. And many teachers are just willing to join these reform movements because they hope that their job will be easier. 10 years later, they see that the pupils have become more difficult, and so it was not a short way. So this is one issue, and here we have a pendulum movement. You have liberalization, then you see that business enterprises don't find people to hire because the simple question, how much is 3 by 4, can no longer be calculated, and so on, and then we get the reform movement. So here we have a swing of pendulum. The other issue is this movement towards self-criticism, confessions. I confess to be a white person, and I'm full of shame for that, and I will try to get the proper punishment to become a better, that is not so white a person. So this is something we really have to avoid. The proper place for confessions, at least for Catholics, is the confessional in the churches. It is not the classroom. Yeah. And all the things you describe, which have been very common under communist times, we are quite close to that if we want to produce better human beings by the schooling system. This is not what we can achieve, I guess. We can achieve that persons get a certain spirit of learning, a willingness to broaden up their minds, but making better human beings, well, this we can forget about. And the third issue, and this is, I guess, the most important one, is the issue of criticism. Some statements at this panel, at other panels, sounded as if criticism per se would be a bad thing. I'm a patriot. And there comes a teacher who says, hey, there are some problems with patriotism. Is this a challenge for me? Is this an attack of our values? Or is it maybe some kind of readjustment, that we have gone a bit too far, that we have become a bit too sharp in our positions? And who should bring criticism into a society? Parents have their value system based on their life experiences, and they try to convey this to their children, which is a good thing, no doubt about it. But maybe that the value system, or say the habits of parents, are a bit out of pace with the changes in culture, which are sometimes really necessary. So who should bring the criticism? And here I think that the educational system is a proper place for bringing criticism and critical innovations into a society. Of course, at the universities, and here we have an absolute bad movement right now with these protective areas, trigger warnings, and so on. This is exactly the opposite of what it should be the case. We do not need to bring criticism against society into the kindergarten or into the early years, but as in the same measure in which the kids grow intellectually, then they should be confronted with alternative views, but of course in a balanced way, such that they have any chance to build an own judgment about that. But let's not mix up all three different things.
Before you guys answer all my questions in this delightful discussion, I want to get a little bit more back to basics, because in your first few answers, I think you all stress that education plays an incredibly important role in conveying ideas, regardless of whatever those ideas are. And I think that explains why certain malignant ideologies choose education to convey it. But why now? Why are we seeing it so much happening now? Because Bonnie alluded to it earlier, you know, my own home county, Loudoun County, for those who don't know, is now infamous in the United States. You know, Bonnie can't help but laugh every time I tell her I'm from Loudoun County, because it's, you know, has an insane school board that is really inflicting one of the worst instances of critical race theory. I went there from 2010 to 2014 and saw none of it. I had a very conservative school growing up. We were made fun of because, you know, we still did abstinence only. We couldn't talk about homosexuality or abortion in the schools. It was a quite conservative school I went to. And like I said, I finished in 2014, and now only, you know, 6 years later, or 8 years later, you know, it's a completely different scenario. So I want to ask, for at least the Americans, what has happened in the U.S. school system that has caused these changes? And then for our international, do you see some of the things in your own country happening?
Yeah, I'm going to say, first of all, it isn't just now. People are just waking up to it now. It's been happening for a long time. The incident with my daughter happened 10 years ago. I was very struck by the word criticism, because I was exposed to critical theory years ago when I was in an English PhD program, and many of these theories, this ideology come out of the humanities. And so in terms of what's happening in our schools, I think we're reaching critical mass with critical theory. But just to be more recent about it, what happened in the last 2020, I guess, when George Floyd was killed in the United States of America, that is when we saw a summer of great unrest in protests, some of which turned into riots in the streets. And when students went back to school in the fall, the curriculum was so different, it was almost unrecognizable. But it was clear. And I started working on Undoctrinate probably not long after I pulled my daughter out of school. I just started keeping track of these stories. It was and I would hear them from people, and I'd be like, well, would you go to the news with this? Oh, no, no, no. And so people were afraid to come forward because my child goes to that school. I don't want to get them in trouble. So I knew about a lot of these stories, but I couldn't verify them. I couldn't document them. And people started documenting them, and parents were suddenly very shocked. It was very obvious that the curricular materials had been created long before they were suddenly imported into the schools. That was obvious to me, so that was very eye-opening. This has been underway for a long time.
Well, getting back to Aristotle's statement that education should be relative to the regime, well, the bad news is that this is the sort of education that is relative to and oriented toward preserving our current regime. We have basically a rapacious technocratic oligarchy governing the country. They have ransacked, pretty much every red county, or counties that are now red, exported their manufacturing to other countries, and airdropped sophisticated pharmaceuticals, and instead to kind of numb the population and keep them happy. And in order to kind of cover up this crime or to justify themselves, they have a secret stash of ideologies that they bring out, as a kind of shocking surprise. It changes every few years. It was, check your privilege a few years ago, and I don't know what it is today because I'm several thousand miles away at the moment. Who knows what it could be? And these constantly changing forms of
it's
ideology
sexualized books now.
Are what?
Sexualized books is this year's
Well,
theme.
sure, yeah, right. And we just spent an hour and a half on that, so I've already forgotten. These it's not just it's not just like, oh, the educators became Marxist and, you know, Marxism is related to liberation. It's a form of ideological education that creates a certain sort of person that's needed for this to continue. It creates a person who is, you know, extremely dependent upon trends that are presented to them through advertising. You know, the people created by the system become, you know, good consumers, like blind consumers of whatever comes next. And you know, as long as Amazon, you know, Facebook, Apple, and Google and Netflix, you know, meet the minimum diversity requirements which they themselves have created through, you know, lobbying on their behalf, no one questions like the fundamental kind of economic disjunction or the fundamental problem. So, you know, the bad news is that this is the form of education which is perpetuating the regime, and unfortunately, you know, much as I, you know, am in favor of carve-outs on a practical level for parents to, you know, pass on true traditions, it's a political problem.
For example, Werner, do you see the stuff that we've talked about in America? Is this happening in Germany as well?
Yes, it is, not in the same degree that you have described in your book. And by the way, we have seen something similar already a couple of decades ago. In the 70s, we had really an influx of Marxist ideas in our school system, such that the whole topics of history, citizenship, political education, even German language classes were deeply changed. So it's not the first time that we experience these things. What we see in Germany is that, well, in the tide of intellectual currents, leftist, green, political movements have assumed, have won the intellectual and cultural hegemony. And they are exerting this hegemony. And in the course of exerting this hegemony and being proud that now we have defeated these ugly conservatives, looking backwards, now we can put on the front of the agenda critical whiteness, post-colonial studies. We can work through all these things that these conservatives simply do not see. And we are happy to be able to do that, and we get support from the United States, from everything which is written in English, we get support for our agenda. This is exactly what we see, and it's the second time that we go through this, and we will survive like we survived the Marxist wave.
And János, you mentioned how you had seen this before under communism. Has Hungary successfully rid itself of this in their school system, or does even Hungary, which we always hold up, you know, which sometimes is held up as a, you know, a classic conservative country, does Hungary have to deal with radical teachers, you know, trying to bring in ideas to students today?
There are people like that because we are living in a small global world, so all the trends are coming in, and there are some organizations and mechanisms which they have the role to pump in this content and ideology, of course, into the country. There are local routes for them too, but there is one fundamental thing, namely that when we are thinking about American society or German society, whether we want or not, we are still thinking about the ground or basement from the 80s, roughly. That's my estimation. But you've changed. There's a new America, new realities, and Germany is not the Germany of my youth, and we loved you. And we observe this change with a certain amount of horror and desperation. This is the heart of Europe, so it's not just a game. Yeah. When they fall, many things fall as well in the continent, but we haven't changed. So my grandfather, who is not living anymore, and I could understand each other very well. Of course, Facebook and other things, the laptop, and that might be rather new for him, but the core cultural things could be understood by him. Although I could tell some new things for him, but we share certain things. Let's say there is a continuity which is not broken by values, traditions, and so on. And this continuity, I cannot judge your situation, although I have my opinion, but it's an endangered continuity in your cases. This is a fundamental difference. The rest, the bubbling political things, is on the surface, it's one thing, but the continuity is still living on here. And the fight is about this continuity. That's the spine. If the spine is broken, you can exercise your hands, it helps for the muscles, but the spine is broken.
Let me add a remark on that, because you're absolutely right with your observations, in particular with your concerns about German developments. What makes the situation so difficult or complicated in Germany is that all these educational issues, racism, blah, blah, it's no blah, blah, just a short way to express difficult things. This is mixed in Germany with the issue of immigration. Because immigration is systematically used in Germany as a means for to transform the society, to break the spine of old Europe, old Germany, to go to better times. And this migration issue is coupled with human rights. So you come from human rights to immigration, to school programs, to the stance you take towards critical whiteness and so on. So this is really difficult. So you have to fight on different ideological fronts. And this is no fun. Although we are only in the beginning, you're already in the middle of the battle.
Well, can I ask, in Germany, are people open about their feelings, or do people self-censor?
People do self-censor. We have a culture of hypocrisy. Everybody knows that things you say in private should not be spoken out in public, not in your office, not with your colleagues. You know exactly the proper place where to say what, and everybody knows about it. The issue is that the media are very much under control of our left social democratic progressives, so they can hunt down every dissenter and, like Lenin put it, or was Mao Zedong one time, punish one and educate 100 persons. So these ones are systematically punished, and the hundreds left remain silent, and therefore we have this climate of hypocrisy.
Yeah, you would think that in Germany, the remaining silent would be something that they would want to teach kids not to do. And in America, you know, free speech makes free people, and this culture of self-censorship that is growing in the United States is a break with tradition that is very fearful and must be opposed.
Great, thank you. So let's get back to your book, which is, after all, what we're here. And it seems like your book, Undoctrinate, is a appeal to parents, you know, in a lot of ways, because I believe your subtitle is what we can do about it. So what exactly is the role of parents? Because I think we've all alluded to it here and there. But in your mind, what exactly is the role of parents in supervising their children's education? Are you asking them to take a new role? Or are you asking them to reclaim one that parents have forfeited?
I'm alerting them of what's going on so that they can take whatever role they decide for themselves. I'm not going to tell any parents what they should or shouldn't do. I think they need to, however, have the facts. And so I think that parents, you know, I'm a parent and I'm a teacher, so I can look at it from either perspective. But of course parents' voices need to be heard, and they are being heard. I mean, we have a parents' movement right now going on in the United States that is formidable, and that is awesome, and that gives me great hope and consolation. And I feel like I've been sort of screaming in the void until the fall of 2020, and I tried to sell this book for 6 years. And I had an agent to whom I sold other books, and she wouldn't take it, and I fired her. And then suddenly, after the riots and everything in 2020, they were like, "Could you have this written yesterday?" You know, and so it was very difficult for me to get a voice for the book, and now suddenly many people are awakened. So I feel much better. I've been terrified for the last 10 years, but I suddenly feel relief, and now everyone else can be terrified, because I'm like, thank goodness the cavalry has arrived.
All right, well, now let's ask everyone else who is now terrified because of you. For you, when we're talking about this education, for you, what exactly is the role of parents or the family in the educational process, and especially being aware of dangerous or malignant ideologies being taught to their children? Any of you can answer first.
Well, parents can't take anything for granted anymore, or they shouldn't. And that goes, I mean, that works in a number of different ways. Obviously, it would be, I think, a better situation if all of the parts of society were working together to, educate children in a classical Western way, which in some ways is like the deep and abiding regime of the West. It hasn't totally disappeared, so it's still there to conform to. Parents can't take that for granted, so they have to exercise more oversight. At the same time, they also can't expect to hide things from their children either. In America, we have a large independent schooling and homeschooling group. I mean, my wife and I homeschool as well, and so there's because of the educational freedom and options that we still have in the United States, it is easy or not impossible to kind of carve out something on the side. But I think now is a time where even parents who want to give their children a traditional and classical education have to prepare them proportionately to their age for what the reality is and how they can successfully navigate it. Again, my view is ultimately on the more political side. I think it would be better if all of the education, if we had coherent societies that were working together, state, church, parents, and communities to educate children in the same way and in a good way. But in America, we do have this tradition of freedom and independence, and given that the schools, public schools in particular now, and some private schools as well, are pushing an adverse agenda. Obviously, parents need to become much more informed about their legal rights and take every action they can to perpetuate a good education and give that to their children. So parents can't sit on the sidelines anymore, I guess is my fundamental feeling now.
Well, in my childhood, the proper answer would have been the following one. Parents, school, and church should work hand in hand. And the usual wording was church, school, and parents should work together. So things are not difficult. I personally cannot, I'm not an expert of what you describe in your book, because our two kids went in a liberal Catholic school. So the ground wave was Catholic, no problem about that, but there were some liberal modulations such that the best of both worlds could be found there, and this was quite wonderful. For the rest of the question, well, it's like in a handbook on pedagogical issues. Of course, parents should provide their children with a life world full of trust, warmth, strengthening each other with a certain degree of discipline, not exaggerated, but clear rules should be set, and children should at any time know that they can get to the parents to talk about whatever. I do not say that I achieved all of that together with my wife and my own family, but very much we achieved that, and we didn't have any problem. This was let me say, the hard part of the book, of your book to read. This description, which apparently is an experience of many American families. I found wonderful the rest of the book when we gave practical advice of what to do. Exactly, this needs to be done whenever the situation occurs, and it's occurring in Germany as well, unfortunately.
Well, from a tactical point of view, parents can be appreciated. That's a good move. It's an exile for this collapsing public sphere, and the creation of islands of freedom. It's a good idea, I think, from a tactical point of view. But strategically, I think sooner or later we should have a reconquista of the public. Public healthcare, which you don't necessarily have, but in Europe we do have. Public schooling, public broadcasting, public TV channels, which is a European tradition, and the Germans were very strong at it in the 70s, 80s. Those high quality, consensual and open services, which are free, balanced, and debatable in every single day. that is the strategic aim, of course, the reconquer the public. If we lost the public for a certain period of time, of course, tactically, exile and parental networks and parental movement is a very good move, which I would strongly support. But I would like to draw your attention to one thing, namely that these pains of the transformation and crisis are mostly relevant in our circles, but Asian parents and Asian families, they don't suffer this thing. And whole countries like China, they basically adopted Western natural sciences. They work hard in physics, chemistry, mathematics, biology. They are eating knowledge, and they work very hard, and they seem to be rather successful, at least on the economic sphere, right because they have adopted that culture, which is so much endangered in Western countries. That's an ironical thing, and no sensible Asian would ever challenge the merits of Western civilization. Other Asians would think that he's a mad person or she's a mad person. So this crisis is our family crisis, but others are very happy with our traditions and are going ahead with that.
I think you're absolutely right about the importance of reconquering these public goods and public services. That's a shift that you're beginning to see on the American right. Again, for many decades, the American right has been primarily oriented toward seeking individual exceptions or kind of withdrawing. Well, we shouldn't exercise power because the Democrats might come in and exercise power too. Well, the long-term result of that is basically that a left liberal elite controls all of these critical institutions. So I think, setting aside the issue of what parents themselves should do, which is, as you said, a tactical question from a strategic standpoint, starting to see some more desire among American conservatives to reconquer those institutions and set them up on a good public basis.
Well, and if I could add to that, too, I think that includes encouraging our children to consider teaching as a profession. I was very discouraged when I was in an event in Washington, D.C., listening to people I thought I agreed with disparaging teachers. And I didn't write this book to malign the teaching profession. I am an American teacher. And, there's always this idea that teachers don't earn any money. I don't really think teachers are paid that badly, and you get a tremendous amount of vacation time, and there's tremendous intrinsic rewards that go with it. But also, I heard someone say, you could teach for America and then go get a real job. And I had to say, teaching is a real job. And then another person said, we all know the only people who become teachers are people who thought high school was fun, cheerleaders and jocks. And I didn't respond to that, but I did ask, how many of the people in this room would tell your children that teaching is a worthwhile career to pursue? And I got snorts and heads bowed, and I said, well, then we're all part of the problem.
Thank you for that. So let's talk about some of these strategies or tactics. And let me ask a little bit of a radical or provocative question. Is all of this just a problem of public schooling? Because in the grand scheme of history, public schooling is a relatively new invention, just at least mass public schooling, that is. I think, I know the Prussians, developed a rather effective schooling system that we adopted in a lot of ways in the turn of the last century. So is public school part of the problem? Do we just need to abolish public school? And would that fix this problem, Bonnie?
There are actually more checks and balances with public schools than there are in private schools. It's harder. I'm starting to keep track of teachers who are getting fired for doing this sort of thing, and it does happen. We don't hear as much about it. We hear the shocking story of what went wrong, and then we don't hear about the consequences. So I am in close contact with parent groups representing private schools, some of the most affluent, elite private schools in America, and I can tell you it is much, much worse in the private schools. For some reason, wokeness, if we can use that term to describe this phenomenon, seems to be an affliction of the affluent. Specifically, affluent white women seem to be the most afflicted.
And it's not an affliction, though. I mean, just getting back to the political point, it's literally how they rule. That's the ruling class, and that...
It's how they rule?
Yes.
By teaching this ideology?
Yes. It prevents challenges. because it keeps people in a kind of volatile state, kind of like you're waiting on the next decree of the Central Committee of the Communist Party in order to find out what the line is this year. It's like, well, what's the most what's going to be the subject of
but
the
their
crusade
ideology
this year?
is saying that oppressed people are being oppressed by the oppressors, and they're the oppressor.
Yeah, I mean that's yeah. So it's precisely making that point that insulates them from criticism, but the other aspect of it is with regard to the sexual liberation stuff, which we were talking about on the previous panel. Elite or wealthy people have good support networks. They have like a lot that they can fall back on. They're able to kind of navigate the system better while exercising more personal freedom. In other communities that doesn't work. It just sows even more dysfunction. And together, both of those aspects reinforce the regime.
I still think by their own argument they should be removed of their power. But I see that they're saying it's not us, it's them. But it's them. It's you. Yeah.
One a little ironic comment that in the last decades of the Roman Empire, the divorced, hyper-educated and very rich single women, aristocratic women, organized the mass baptization of the Latin Roman population to Christianity, because the whole story was so incredible for Romans, educated and Romans. But these women were the engines of this incredible turn. So these are patterns, repeating patterns.
Great, thank you. And we have a few more minutes before we open up to question and answer. So I think my last question is, let's say all of our hopes are realized. We stop this indoctrination of our school system. We get a school system that actually, instead of indoctrinates, teaches civic values, communal values. But what do we do with all the people who are already indoctrinated? Because, we're really seeing, it's been long enough, I think, where we're seeing a generation. I saw a video a couple months ago of law students in Georgetown, being caught, demanding safe space to cry. And this is like a prestigious law school. And these people, the people who have already graduated, they're entering law firms, they're becoming clerks for judges. So, let's say we fix this problem. We still are going to have a lot of people who are still indoctrinated. Is there anything we can do about that? And this is open for anybody. So, but maybe we start with you, Bonnie.
Well, I would ask, how did you survive how did you undoctrinate yourself after your education?
That's a good question, because my father was a believer, an honest communist. So it was my internal soul searching and struggle. It took like 15 years. It was a traumatic journey. But it happened. And I became an entrepreneur. It helped a lot. That was the other extreme of life. So it takes time. Yeah. It's like a heavy drinker and a healing process.
Well, what is the book by Miloš Česlav? What's the name of the book?
Česlav Miloš.
Captive Mind.
Captive Mind.
He talks about his journey to reclaim his own thinking, right?
But in the American case, I think, because in history usually crisis and wars help a lot. These people, these indoctrinate, they are not, how can I say it in English, they are not for life. No profession, no real skills. They cannot differentiate shit from shinola. This is why they live in ideology. And crisis, hunger, or war can help a lot. I don't wish that. But a little bit of economic crisis and some further collapse of social services might help a lot. It's like a cold shower after a crazy night, and that's not a very nice proposal. But I'm serious. Crisis in Chinese means first two signs. One is difficulty, and the other sign is option, 危机. So in difficulty, you have the new possibilities.
I would say too, I have faith in students. I just because you're introduced to, I feel like the The medium is the message. And I think that the medium is terrible. People don't like being treated this way. They don't like being shamed or humiliated or told told to self-censor, and they internalize that, and then they associate this with the education they were given. And then in America, they do have the freedom to seek out options, and I think that they are. So I wouldn't presume that just because this is the education that they are given, that is what they take away from it. And that's probably a good side of social media, is that there are other ways to deliver information to students. I recommend supplementing kids to parents, supplementing students with better information if you're unhappy about what's. I feel sorry for the students because you go to school all day and then let's counteract that after school. Unfortunately, I feel like some of that is necessary, or summer boot camp or something where you can go to, what are they not talking about in school these days? Let's go eat. And so we're working on some of that, content at my job and on my own. Yes.
Well, these are two issues. The one issue is the indoctrination of students, and here I fully agree with you. The other issue is the indoctrination of those who have been submitted to a longer process of doctrination. And here I agree with you. We in Germany have a lot of experience with that, by the way. We have those who have been indoctrinated by communists during GDR, and we have had, and still have to a certain degree for biological reasons, those who have been indoctrinated during the Nazi period, which did not last as long as the communist period, but it needs to be seen in the context of World War I, Versailles, which is the equivalent to Trianon, which in Hungary has left deep wounds in the political culture of the country. And here, in fact, catastrophes are something like, a purging thunderstorm, if this is a correct expression. The communists saw their system collapse, not only in East Germany, but they saw it collapse in Poland, Hungary, Russia, and so on. And they found themselves that in the midst of the class enemy, they were conducting a much better life with a better future. So this helps a lot. And those who were fervent believers in Nazism, they saw the ruins in which Germany was after the Second World War, and they saw the pictures from the concentration camps, and this helped a lot to undoctrinate these persons. So it is important, it is really important to teach history, to show the aberrations, not only of the Germans and whatever people. There are so many aberrations, such that lessons can be drawn from them. We do not need, so to speak, the proper gospel, and all the non-believers are bad persons, which are out of paradise, of course, but they need to be driven out of our wonderful countries because they need to be blossoming under the proper gospel. No, we need a proper way of dealing with conflicts over our worldviews, conflicts over the proper way to handle different interests and so on. And this form of undoctrination, meaning teaching civil virtues, the rules of democracy as the only game in town, this is the proper way of indoctrination, and this is a never-ending task because the attractiveness of ideology, whatever this ideology may be, anti-racism, racism, whatever, the attractiveness of ideology throughout times is so high because it gives a soul relief. It gives a transcendental context to your thinking, to your very existence. So the task of undoctrinizing never comes to an end.
Yeah, and I think always be wary of simple answers to complex questions, which is often the sign that you're in the indoctrinating realm.
All right, well, with that, let's move to the questions from the audience. If you haven't already, please submit your questions to the Slido app, and we'll try to get to as many as possible. So one of these questions struck out to me, and this is a little bit of an American context, but I think even in Germany or Hungary you could understand the problem. How do we discuss racial inequalities in education in the US without shaming privileged kids, but also reflect on problems even if they're uncomfortable? So what's the proper way to talk about racism in our education system? instead of this critical race theory?
I think that there are I think there are many ways to do it skillfully. I think it depends on the relationship that the teacher has with the students. I think one thing I learned as a teacher is that what works with one group of students might not work with another group of students, depending on their maturity level, depending on the specific composition of the classroom. So I guess, yeah, carefully. You would do it very carefully. I think that anything that can be taken personally is liable to raise the emotional temperature of the room. And some things, frankly, cannot be discussed with certain age groups or with certain classes because it's just not going to be a productive, meaningful learning experience. So sometimes you do it, like maybe not everything needs to be a discussion. Maybe it needs to be private reflection. Or you submit individual papers to the teacher, and then they're just graded on how well you expressed your opinions, not on what those opinions are. Yeah, I think that when it's personal, that probably you want to preserve the privacy of the student to not have to share it in a group setting. That's my counseling background. I wouldn't broach certain uncomfortable topics in front of their peers. That's very awkward.
I don't, oh yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just saying thank you.
Yeah, I don't want to give a glib answer to the question because it is a complicated one. I would just say about, I taught for a year, I taught middle school for a year after college, and was teaching history, and so I went to the library and pulled out as many old, U.S. history school books as I could, from the conservative, pre-1950, like 1950s and before era, and obviously, I'm a conservative fellow, but the story written in them was absurd. I mean, it was like America was a empty continent. And one day, the English Puritans were the first to arrive. And they found before them, their destiny. Unfortunately, although they thought it was empty, there were some very pesky people there, who claimed to have been there for a long time. And there were also very, very extremely wicked people from Spain. And there was a glorious triumph to which we are all the inheritors, and there were no other problems, end of story. It was kind of like that. I mean, like, these were just utterly absurd books, although, again, in the way that all education does, is, I think, serving the regime at the time in some way. So, I don't have an easy answer. It seems that one good starting point would be, not afflicting students with guilt for things that they really aren't participating in. There's a lot of theoretical things to sort out there, but the current framework is basically, if you're of European descent, everyone's the same. You're all participating in the same racist power structure. And therefore, you're guilty of every crime that had been perpetuated by European people from the 15th century to the present. So, unfortunately, we have to probably start with excising ideological views like that. And then, again, don't want to be glib, but one way around that is to discuss where people are actually from and what their history is in America. It is a good question. People come from all sorts of different backgrounds. America is a place where those are often forgotten. But learning the history of the American states, Ohio, and Cleveland and Chicago were places where Central and Eastern European immigrants came. Their story in America is extremely different from that of the English. It's extremely different from that of the French. I think putting things in a more North American context and trying to understand the French, the English, the Spanish waves of entrance to America and all of the different stories is a worthwhile goal that is maybe less controversial than what we're facing now. But I would just again say that in a way, to give maybe not credit to the critical race theory world, again, all you have to do is open up an American history textbook from 1900 to see, like, okay, well, this was a story that was so distorted that there's an inevitable reaction against it.
Well, can I just say, though, I think that listening to you tell that, cartoonish caricature of the American story reminds me of, I think, that now they're getting the cartoonish, caricaturish counter-narrative to that story that is equally distorted, and perhaps even more so. And so we need to, you've got thesis and then antithesis, and can we find a synthesis somewhere in the middle that's a little more nuanced than what the kids are hearing now?
That's a complicated thing because the American nation was created with a purpose. The idea was this city on the hill, almost selected people, chosen people, a hybrid democracy, the founding fathers and other. So it's not a nation, but a super nation with a hybrid character. And maybe you will become, through these pains, a normal nation, which is always, but it's a loss for the world. And you must be aware of that, so it's a pity. And I don't know whether it's a functionable thing to be a normal nation with all the terrible things which we have in Europe, but we are used to it. But if Americans are becoming normal, something important will disappear from the world, which we thought it was very positive. Very positive.
Werner, I'm curious to hear your views, because I think one of the stereotypes about Germany is that they're incredibly self-flagellant over obvious reasons. In your opinion, how do you think is the proper way to discuss uncomfortable issues where perhaps your people did do something wrong, but not do it in the way that is happening in the United States, where it unduly burdens or guilts current generations on actions that previous generations have done?
I think we've done very much in the proper way. That is to be quite open to learn things we would not like to hear because they should not have happened, to know about these things, to talk about openly wherever bad consequences of bad actions can be bettered, improved, helped. Do that, accept that the consequences of crimes will not disappear from the world. They are there, including all the wounds and the consequences, but allow time to do time's work. See, in earlier times, when a peace treaty was concluded in Europe, one of the articles of the European peace treaties until the 19th century, when nationalism and democracy came up together as twins, one clause of the peace treaties was that for all times and ever, no one should speak ever again of all the atrocities committed by both sides in this war, because this is the foundation for peace. This is perhaps a bit too much. This is a bit too much. This is reason of state, but this is not the way people should deal with each other. But it makes absolutely no sense to teach pupils, like it is sometimes done in German schools, that as a German, born, say, like myself in 1953, or born in 2000, you should feel guilty. And whenever something is talked about Holocaust and so on, you should feel ashamed because, well, there are nations of which it is easier to be a member than Germany. This is true. But nevertheless, this is how things have evolved. You have to be open on that. You have tried to do the right thing now if it has not been done in the past. But then you should accept there are new generations which cannot be taken accountable for all these things. They can be taken accountable for how they deal with these things, glorifying crimes, saying these crimes have not happened. This is unacceptable. But being open, being honest, being friendly to each other, being curious about things that have not yet been detected but should be detected as well. This is the proper stance, and I feel that apart from this self-flagellation and this German pride, we In earlier times, we were scientifically the biggest nation in the world. Then we were the biggest nation when it came to crimes. Still, we are the biggest nation when it comes to moral standards. This attempt of Germany to be the biggest and the best one, this should be stopped.
Thank you very much for that. And I find that very interesting because it seems no matter if you're German, American, when these ideas come, they find some crime that you've committed, you know, no matter how white your history actually is. There's something, you know, I don't know what they'll find for Hungary. There's probably a couple examples they could use, but they'll find something, you know, about a country's history and make that the crux upon which everything has to be based. So I have another interesting question, which is, what can we do about the lobbying of these ideas on social media platform? Because a lot of this education sometimes isn't occurring in schools, but perhaps on TikTok, on Facebook, on Twitter, where a lot of these ideas are quite as rampant. And maybe a similar question is, does that mean parents should also be concerned about what their kids are seeing on social media?
I would say yes, parents should be concerned, but generally speaking, the remedy for bad speech is more speech, not enforced silence. So respond to it.
Any of you others have a response? No? Great. Well, no, I think that's a fairly good answer. What about schools with religious affiliations? Because we talked about several different types of schools. Bonnie, have you noticed any similar trends of what has occurred in religious schools, which we might think be immune to this ideas?
Yeah, I think that religious schools really vary, and I am aware of some parents, Catholic parents, who are suing have filed lawsuits because they think that their child's school is not adhering. They've sued the diocese for not upholding Catholic doctrine in their children's schools. So these ideologies are in religious schools as well, but not all of them. It really varies, and do your homework. It's case by case.
Go ahead.
No, I mean, that seems larger. Again, religious education in the American context is different from what it might be here, where you know, we just have a much more varied religious tradition with sort of lots of new things created by our context of religious freedom. So you can have, you know, official Catholic schools, independent Catholic schools, private schools that are, you know, lightly religious, private schools that are intensely religious. You know, it really does run the gamut, as it were. So it's a wild world out there in American private education, for sure.
Well, and in public education too, I would say that this situation varies from school to school, but even within a school from classroom to classroom, depending on the teacher. And so there are going to be classrooms within a school that are very traditional. So talk to other parents, talk to the administration, talk to other parents. Parents know, or at least parents are starting to find out now. And yeah, so these can be localized infections.
Thank you. So, you know, we've talked a lot, and I think mostly about kind of primary and secondary school in this conversation. But I think what a lot of people forget is that, you know, many universities are also teaching this. If you don't get it in high school, you'll get it in university. And I feel like there's not, at least in the United States, not too much action against publicly funded universities that do that. For example, I'm at Virginia Tech right now, and Virginia recently elected a very anti-critical race theory governor. But, you know, I get emails from my school about how they just set up what they call a Black Affinity Group. And it's, you know, a group designed to help advance the careers. And I believe the different groups were Black, Latinx, you know, LGBTQ, and veterans. You know, so a lot of these ideas are really being still funded by sometimes conservative governments, because I think even in hard Republican states, public universities sometimes still embrace these theories. So what are the tactics we can take to universities? Are they the same as primary and secondary schools, or is that a whole new ball game when we're talking about university indoctrination?
Well, I think I would just refer specifically to the ed schools, the education schools in America, to answer this question, because they have the most direct effect on what's going on in K-12, which is the subject which I wrote about. But yes, obvious, so much of what's going on in K-12 has I call it downward drift. It's drifted from the academy into the K-12 schools because that's where the teachers had to train. And most of them specifically had to go to the education schools. And, you know, the history of education schools, I think most people would agree that the main ones now are completely monocultural and that they don't even know there's another point of view on most of these issues, which is a huge problem to overcome at this point. And, you know, probably the most assigned book in education schools, this is documented, is Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And so this language is now what we hear in all of the schools. So we need to address this problem of lack of ideological balance in the ed schools, in the universities. I'm not saying don't read that book. I'm saying read books that convey, you know, opposing points of view, and then weigh for yourself which, you know, which ideas have most merit.
Great, thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, I rather have a question. Is there a connection between the soft or hard nature of a certain discipline and the level of this locust breakthrough? Like in soft areas, they are stronger. That's my...
Yeah, it's, I first encountered this as an English major, and I think a lot of it came out of the humanities with critical theory and deconstructionism, and this sort of attack on objective reality and narratives, and, you know, it actually reached the point in English, I dropped out of English literature over this because it was literally reaching the point where they said you could read War and Peace or you could read a restaurant menu. It's all what you take away from it, and you can take as much away from, you know, I could say that Oliver Twist is about an orphan in London who finds his true family, or it could be about butterflies in the Ukraine. It's like, this is my perspective. That's what I read in this book. And I just thought, this is nonsense. But yeah, I would say the social sciences are very heavily affected, and education is one of the social sciences.
On that I agree. The only thing I want to add is that we should not see at these things as if there would be the good guys from the hard sciences and the bad guys from the humanities. Because it is exactly the job of sociologists and generally of people working in the humanities, to look at how society is constructed, at how culture is constructed, what cultural patterns are conveyed to the next generation, what they do in practice, what goes well together and what is detrimental in the long course. So criticism coming from the humanities is exactly the job the humanities are supposed to do. And if they do it, and if they educate their students in this kind of criticism, changing from time to time. In earlier times it was Marxist, then came the endless turns in the humanities and so on. So if they convey this to their pupils, this is exactly what they are supposed to do. And it's no problem as long as there is open, pluralist discourse at the universities, as long as there is no intellectual monoculture. And I refer to something I said before, bringing this critical mind over the teachers educated at universities into the schools is not a bad thing per se. It needs to be handled carefully in the way which we have discussed. Again, it is true, the humanities are much more afflicted by even nonsensical theories. No need to repeat all of them, the names of all of them, but it is their job to do such critical and sometimes disturbing things.
I tend to think that education is, the state of education is epiphenomenal, and that the fundamental question is actually about power, and that in the case of, rebalancing, fixing the ideological balance in American higher education, it's not going to come about from just, calling for educational freedom or, calling for an inclusion of, both sides in any argument or something like that. It's a political battle, and a battle of will and intention. The left liberal teachers unions made this clear during the coronavirus pandemic, when they fled the classroom and and basically kept students online because they refused to go back to class. That was a political battle. It can only be won by one side or the other. And so the American universities enjoy extraordinary financial privileges. It's sometimes, the joke is sometimes made that, the large American research university is a sports program and a hedge fund with a small, academic program attached to it. So those, when we have political power, we have to use it. Again, most American conservatives come from the background in which, well, we just want to have, fair and equal discussion of ideas. That's not the state of play. Now you have more, Republicans talking about, finding ways to financially punish institutions that are, promoting this kind of, corrupting ideology. Tax their endowments. If it's a public institution, restrict the way that the endowment is spent. Cap the number of majors in corrupt departments. I mean, it's a battle of political power ultimately at that level, and it can only be won by one side or the other, having the grit and determination to defeat the other. And maybe if the side that wins, values genuine, free, and open intellectual exchange, then that can result. But at the moment, it's not going to result just by hoping to kind of put it back in there. Again, these are financially privileged institutions that are part of a larger power structure, and only a countervailing power will be able to bring them to heel. And the political goal should be stated in that way. The goal has to be to bring the elite American universities to heel. And that's a different way of thinking, but it's the only way that there's a path, I think.
Can I add too, we do have a group of concerned professors who belong to Heterodox Academy that you might want to check out, which, they're trying to balance the academy.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Well, with that, we are out of time. Would you all please join me in thanking these wonderful panelists for a great discussion? And with that, this discussion is concluded.